Welcome back, my homeboys and girls. We are here today to review Period 4, APUSH. Remember, if you feel that these videos are helping you and you get use out of them, make sure you give me a like or you subscribe and tell all your APUSH friends, right? All right, so let's review this APUSH Period 4. This goes from about 1800 to about 1848. There's a lot of big ideas in here because we're now past those first days and first administrations of Washington and Adams. Now we're rolling more towards the politics and sectionalism and getting that road to the Civil War going. So what are the big ideas? College Board wants you to know a couple of things. First and foremost, the relationship and the role between the federal and the state governments. This comes under fire under many different instances. Who should have more power? Who should have more control? And this is an argument that's been going back all the way since the Articles of Confederation. Next, the rapid economic, territorial, and demographic changes in the country. We're heading westward, and what goes with that are changing economies, new territory. What is it going to look like? How is it going to look? And who's going to be in it? As I mentioned, sectionalism is going to increase. We've always had the North and the South, but now we're adding that third section in the country, the West. Next, the new republic is going to extend more rights, more democratic rights, but unfortunately that's only going to mean for white dudes. Unfortunately, women and minorities are not included in that, and we'll talk more about the struggle for movements like the women's rights movement and abolitionist movement. And speaking about movements, we're going to mention how the Second Great Awakening is going to prompt or be the impetus for many of the reform movements during this, what we call antebellum era. So, one of the key points here is that America is expanding, although we haven't officially gotten to manifest destiny just yet. We really are a country of manifest destiny all the way since the colonies, and we've been expanding from the 13 colonies out to the old Northwest Territory, Louisiana Purchase, Spain, later on Texas, Oregon Country, California, etc. So always remember that huge theme, and that is a theme that the exam really likes to talk about. Next, so you see westward expansion, you see where we are as of 1790. We are at the Mississippi River, that's kind of our boundary. We don't have Florida or any of that yet. We certainly don't have Texas or anything past or west of the Mississippi River. And you can see the density of our population. We're still pretty much in the 13 colonies. We're heading a little bit more towards the frontier in places like Tennessee and Kentucky. The old Northwest Territory is kind of being staked out and claimed a little bit. But then by 1830, okay, we now have the Louisiana Territory. We are now heading further towards Oregon Country. And you can see how our people are moving. So first off, why are people moving? Why is our population growing? Well, the most obvious reason is, well, we're having families and population tends to increase naturally over time. Next, immigration. So the old wave of immigration, old wave of immigrants, your 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the pre-Civil War immigration, that's your Irish, your Germans, your English people coming over. You remember back to, world or global, where the Irish are coming over because of the potato famine. The Germans are coming here because they want land. There's not enough in Europe, and that's pretty much the same with the English as well. What's allowing us to move out west? Transportation improvements. The Erie Canal is built in the 1820s. That allows us to connect the Hudson River, the New York trading post area to the west now, those western markets, the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes area. Our first national road, the Cumberland Road, is built connecting east and west, and then the railroads are starting to come around. And the railroads are not popular just yet, but they're on their way to becoming a huge force in later on monopolies. Finally, cotton production increases, which means we're going to need more slaves. So although the slave trade is over in the early 1800s, it doesn't mean that slavery is over. It means that we're not taking slaves from Africa, but now unfortunately you're seeing the breeding of slaves, if you will. And that's obviously a huge problem that's going to manifest itself as we get closer to the Civil War. So what else allows us to move westward besides our population growth, immigration, etc.? Finally, you have certain foreign powers that are removed from the continent, so that allows us to move westward, such as the Louisiana Purchase, right? The French had owned the territory in the west on our frontier for a long time, and through that purchase by Jefferson to Napoleon, we see them virtually removed from the continent once again, which is a big win for us, and without bloodshed. Finally, the British in the War of 1812, although we won the Revolution, although they were kicked out of the 13 colonies, it doesn't mean that they were gone from the continent. They were still on the western frontier, being a huge thorn in our side by supplying weapons and arms to the Native Americans and also impressing our ships on the open seas. And so they're basically bullying us. And finally, the War of 1812 will kind of kick them out of those western frontiers and really start to not completely stop, but settle down the issue of impressment, which had been really bothering us for a while. The Spanish, they have been in the Florida territory and also in the modern day Mexico area. They are not going to be removed from everything, but we will eventually, because of good old John Quincy Adams, will have him broker a treaty between us and the Spanish to buy Florida. And that was a huge win for us because, especially Southerners, because now they don't have to worry about their slaves running away to Florida, which was a free territory. And lastly, we see the Native Americans, their story, their narrative, which is pretty much the same, is that we see a lot of their defeats on the western frontier. And as we defeat them, we keep pushing them further west. Speaking of the Native Americans and their defeats, you have in the old Northwest Territory the Battle of Tippecanoe. That's William Henry Harrison who defeats Tippecanoe. Guys like Little Turtle and William Henry Harrison, future president, who will go on to be president and then unfortunately die within the first month or so of his presidency. That's a story for later. In Florida, the first Seminole Wars, again, similar story. The Native Americans there, they are defeated and they are forced further westward. And the most common story that we pretty much all remember is Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, the Native Americans don't fight physically here. They actually decide to fight in the courthouse. So they sue. In the court case Worcester versus Georgia, I would know this for sure. The Worcester tribe says, no, you cannot push us out of our land. They essentially claim that this is unconstitutional, that this Indian Removal Act is unconstitutional, and they win. John Marshall, unfortunately though, who is Chief Justice, he is challenged by Jackson, and Jackson's president. Jackson, remember, as president is supposed to enforce the law, enforce the ruling of any case. And Andrew Jackson says, John Marshall, make me enforce it. And John Marshall obviously does not have that power. Now, in another time, Jackson could have been impeached and removed from the presidency for breaking the law here, but the sad story is the dudes in Congress, they're all white dudes, right? And they don't really care too much about the Native Americans, so they're not going to impeach a president over Native Americans. And so Worcester versus Georgia, although it's supposed to be a victory for the Native Americans, the Trail of Tears happens anyway, and the Indian Removal Act kicks out the 5 civilized tribes in places like Georgia and Florida to go past the Mississippi River, which is a very sad story. Now, our struggle for neutrality, remember 1793, this is good old G-Dubs, George Washington. He issues that proclamation of neutrality during the French Revolution. Now, the struggle for us to maintain that neutrality keeps on becoming a problem for us during the Jefferson administration. One of our ships, the Chesapeake, was attacked by an English ship, the Leopard, called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. Jefferson is outraged by this. He passes in 1807 the Embargo Act, which says we are not going to trade with anybody. Well, he meant that to hurt the French and the English, and unfortunately, it didn't really hurt them as bad. It hurt us the worst, and because we needed to actually trade with those countries to stay afloat. So he realizes how harmful this was to our economy, and so he kind of amends the Embargo Act before he leaves office, and we pass the Non-Intercourse Act, which says we'll trade with everyone but England and France. That also doesn't help our economy too much. And finally, Macon's Bill number 2 is passed, which says, okay, here's the deal. We'll trade with you as long as you respect our neutrality. And it doesn't really work out too well because we're about to see the War of 1812 become an issue. The one last thing I do want to say about the Embargo Act is that what will happen is unintentionally, Jefferson actually prompts the first industrial revolution. So although its intended purpose was to hurt England and France, it actually hurts our economy, but an unintended consequence is that it prompts our first industrial revolution. Okay, so the struggle for neutrality continues until the War of 1812. We're really upset with the British because they are not respecting our neutrality. They're continuing to impress our sailors, and they are still on the western frontier selling guns to the Native Americans. So we must defend our national honor. We cannot, stand down to these British. We've already stood up to them once. What's a second time going to do? And this is going to involve a couple of major players besides just us in England. You're also going to have Native Americans fighting in this war. For example, Tecumseh, who is going to fight with his Native American friends to support the British because the British told the Native Americans that they will give them the land that the Americans took from them if they fight on their side. And one of the interesting things about this war, and that not a lot of people know, is that we actually had a desire to expand into Canada. And remember, Canada is owned by the British at this time, and so we do invade Canada, but it does not go well for us. We do not expand into Canada. We are not successful. The war is kind of a mess for the Americans. We have Mr. Madison, James Madison's war is criticized, and you even have people talking about secession and talking about trying to secede from the Union because they're unhappy with the way the war is going. But the British have a lot on their hands going on over in Europe with Napoleon. So they look for a truce, and the Americans say, yes, we must take this truce. And we sign the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the War of 1812. Okay, what else we have going on in the continent? We talked about the Louisiana Purchase by Jefferson, the Barbary Pirates under Jefferson. He does not want to follow the Washington and Adams precedent of paying tribute or money to the pirates to leave us alone in the Mediterranean and off the coast of Africa. So he, instead of paying tribute, he winds up using the Navy to go to war. This is a small victory for us, but essentially he doesn't want to pay them any more lunch money. We talked about the War of 1812. Some huge foreign policy wins for John Quincy Adams. As we know, he's going to become a foreign policy guru. He is credited with getting the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which essentially disarms the Great Lakes between the Americans and the British. We have the British-American Convention, which allows us and England to jointly occupy Oregon country for the next 10 years. We'll talk more about that down the road. Adams-Onis Treaty, buying Florida, we talked about, and finally the Monroe Doctrine, which is a huge foreign policy. You must know this one. This likes to show up on the exam a lot, especially when correlating it with Teddy Roosevelt's Roosevelt Corollary. The Monroe Doctrine, very simple, just says, hey, listen, Europe, mind your own hemisphere. You stay on your side of the world, we'll stay on ours. And we will use this for quite a while. Okay, we'll implement this for a long time because we want to be the #1 country in our side of the world, and as long as we don't intervene in Europe's business, then they shouldn't come over here and intervene in our side of the world's business. The story of Texas we'll talk more about in period 5, but Texas was a part of Mexico. Mexico was a part of Spain. Mexico gained its independence. It's its own country. And Texas, the people in Texas, the Americans in Texas, they don't want to follow the Mexican rules. And so they actually break away and declare themselves independent of Mexico. And then there's a huge fight for Texas as far as who does it belong to? Does it belong to Mexico? Does it belong to the Texans or the Americans in Texas? And America doesn't want to get involved for a while because of the issue of slavery. So we'll see more about that later on. Last things, which also have to do with period 5, are Manifest Destiny, James Polk, the Manifest Destiny president. We were pushing further out west, Texas, Oregon, California, etc. And then finally the Mexican-American War, which kind of puts to rest the whole issue of Texas. Okay. What else? The rise of nationalism during this era. We do call this the era of good feelings. So while there is a rise in nationalism and pride, we're really starting to culturally, economically, and politically see a good period here, hence they called the era of good feelings. So culturally, we see a lot of art reflecting how beautiful our landscape and how beautiful the animals here are in America. Economically, we're going to see a lot of nationalism, especially by Henry Clay, who proposes his American system. I would definitely know the 3 major components to his American system, which means number 1, continuing the national bank, 2, a protective tariff to help our goods and help people buy more American-made goods, and then 3, money for internal improvements like the Erie Canal and Cumberland Road. I would know his system, and I would also like you to compare it with Hamilton's system. Right, Hamilton's financial plan, the 4 major components, because you're going to see a lot of similarities like the bank, like the tariff. Okay, so make sure you know each of those plans, each of those systems, if you will, and be able to compare and contrast them. Finally, the political nationalism, you're going to see the Federalists die off after the War of 1812. The Federalists were the ones that criticized James Madison for the War of 1812. They said he wasn't handling it very well. They threatened to secede in the New England area at the Hartford Convention. And then after the Treaty of Ghent is signed, everybody looks to these Federalists and say, wow, you guys were not patriotic. You didn't believe in us. And so you're the bad guys here. And you're going to see the Federalists die out. So you're basically going to see a one-party system, the Democrat-Republicans rule from about 1814 to about 1824, and we'll see why it is it comes to such a crashing end there. Okay, so politically speaking, what's going on in this period 4? We talked about the election of 1800, the peaceful transition of power from the Federalist John Adams to the first Democratic Republican President Jefferson. We mentioned the era of good feelings, political factions within the party, the Democrat Republicans, we're going to see come to a head with the election of Andrew Jackson. The people that follow him are going to be the Democrats and the National Republicans. Okay, we'll talk more about those political factions in a moment. The election of 1824, the corrupt bargain, really ends the era of good feelings because of the corruption that goes down in this election. Basically, the Constitution says in order to win the presidency, you need to earn a majority of the Electoral College votes. Well, it came down to John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and also Henry Clay. So John Quincy Adams proposes to Henry Clay, hey, listen, why don't you have your supporters in the House of Representatives vote for me to be president? And basically Henry Clay says, well, what's in it for me? He says, I will make you my Secretary of State, which is a stepping stone for the presidency at this time. We see Henry Clay accept, and John Quincy Adams winds up becoming the next president, and Andrew Jackson is screwed out of the presidency here, and he will make his comeback in the next election. In that time, we're going to see the age of the common man. This is referred to, not because of Andrew Jackson specifically, but because that we see a lot more regular people being able to vote in many states. We see the elimination of the property requirement, which means more farmers, for example, more people that were your average Joe, if you will, were able to vote. And this helps get Andrew Jackson elected. We're going to see the amount of voters triple by the time Andrew Jackson's presidency is around, because of this age of the common man. And he himself is referring to himself as a common man. He's not someone from the, Washington or Adams or Jefferson beginnings. He's the first president that was never from a founding father family or was never there at the beginning, the constitutional era. So he does consider himself a common person. We do see a split under Andrew Jackson, as I was mentioning before. The Democrats, the ones that are going to support Andrew Jackson, and those that are going to not support him, the National Republicans, or later on more commonly known as the Whigs. So speaking about political parties, here you kind of see a nice breakdown of the political parties from the beginning: the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists die off in the Hartford Convention. The Democratic Republicans experience the era of good feelings, and then all of a sudden, once Andrew Jackson is back, we see a split in the party once again, and the Democrats are going to be your new Democrat Republicans, and the Whigs are going to be your new Federalists. Now, about some women and some other minorities, what is their role in this period? We do see women expected to be at home. We call this the cult of domesticity, and they are expected to raise the children to become good Republicans or good citizens, and that is called Republican motherhood. This is going to culminate in the first women's rights movement, Seneca Falls, upstate New York, 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony get together and they write the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which is essentially the Declaration of Independence. But instead of saying man, it replaces it and says every time we see the word man or men, we see and women added. Okay, they're trying to show that, hey, listen, women are equal to men as well. African Americans, unfortunately, we still see half the country in slavery. The gradual emancipation laws haven't really worked out because we do see Eli Whitney's cotton gin expand slavery. And so you're going to start to see an abolitionist movement rising. We'll talk more about that in period 5. Native people, unfortunately, Native Americans, as we've already mentioned today, that many of them are being pushed further and further west. Finally, sectionalism. I would know about this. Sectionalism is concurrently happening while nationalism is happening during the era of good feelings. We always talk about the North and the South since the beginning of our country's history, but the West is our third section that's continuing to grow as we head further out west. Okay, what else we have going on? State governments are going to continue to resist the federal government at this time, in this period especially. This has been an argument all the way back since the Articles of Confederation, who has more power, and different presidents have different views on this. We already saw how the Hartford Convention, the War of 1812 played out, how you had these guys threaten secession over James Madison's administration, and that led to the death of the Federalists. So that was one issue that came up between state and federal government. The best example of the battle here between states and federal government comes the nullification crisis during the Andrew Jackson era. So there is a tax, or referred to as the Tariff of Abominations of 1828, and the South doesn't like tariffs. Remember, the South doesn't have industry, and so they are forced to pay more tariffs than the North. So they don't support this tariff, and South Carolina especially believes, hey, listen, we're going to look back to Jefferson and Madison when they set the precedent during the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that said if we believe a federal law is unconstitutional, we don't have to follow it. And so they nullify the Tariff of Abominations of 1828. And Andrew Jackson, as president, who is a Southerner, says, no, 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 okay, my job, my duty is to enforce the law, and I must collect this tax from you, otherwise I'm going to have to use military force to do so. Awesome, Andrew Jackson. Thank you now for assuming your responsibility as president to enforce the law. Too bad the Native Americans didn't benefit from this. So Andrew Jackson and South Carolina are in a standoff, and who comes in to save the day? The great compromiser himself, Henry Clay, who passes the Compromise Tariff of 1833, referred to as the olive branch and the sword. The olive branch part of it, the peaceful part of it, says, hey, listen, South Carolina, you're going to have to pay the tariff now, and by 1833, we will lower the tariff over the next few years to compromise your demands. The sword part is Andrew Jackson's military coming in to collect the tax. This way, the government actually receives the money. So this is a conflict that is resolved by Henry Clay, one of many of his compromises. Continuing, the idea of nationalism and sectionalism plaguing the country, or dividing us, if you will. The Second Bank of the United States, remember this is implemented by Henry Clay. This is a northern thing. The South does not like this. The internal improvements is a northern thing. The Erie Canal helps the North, not the South. Even the West as well, so they're in favor of it. The South is not. We mentioned tariffs not being supported by the Southerners. The issue in Missouri in 1820, Missouri wants to enter the Union as a slave state. Unfortunately, we need a balance in Congress, so we're going to see an issue. If Missouri enters the Union as a slave state, okay, what are we going to do to keep the balance in Congress? The great compromiser comes to rescue, and Henry Clay says, why don't we have Maine enter the Union as a free state? This way we have an equal balance between free and slave states. And the last component of that Missouri Compromise is to draw a line through the middle of the country, the 3630 line that says everything from here on out in the Louisiana Territory that once become a state can become a free state above it, and below it will become a slave state. Okay, we mentioned the nullification crisis. And finally, towards the end of Andrew Jackson's presidency, we see the national bank become an issue. The 20-year charter by Henry Clay is coming to an end. Jackson, a Southerner, doesn't like the national bank, and he vetoes the rechartering of the bank. He withdraws all the money from the national bank. He puts it in what he calls pet banks, or which are essentially state banks, because remember, he's a states' rights guy. And you see the destruction of the national bank, and guys like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Nicholas Biddle are going to lose this battle over the national bank, and it winds up setting up the Panic of 1837 as soon as Andrew Jackson leaves office, and he sets up Martin Van Buren's presidency to be one of a recession or a panic. So, talking about the other branch of the government, the Supreme Court, what are they doing during this time? John Marshall is still reigning, the Marshall Court, as we call it. He is a Federalist. Many of his cases are going to give more power to the Federalists, or the federal government, I should say. The most famous of his cases that you need to know is Marbury versus Madison. This was John Adams, upset that he was not reelected, decides that he is going to appoint as many Federalists into government as he can before he leaves office, often referred to as his midnight appointees. As he does this on his way out, William Marbury, who is going to become a judge, doesn't wind up getting his job because the paperwork never made it there in time, and so he sues for his position. John Marshall hears the case and he says, I'm sorry, William Marbury, you are not going to get your job. John Adams was wrong. The precedent that we must know from this whole story, because you don't necessarily have to know the entire story I just told you, you need to know that the Supreme Court realizes their power. They call this judicial review. The Supreme Court up until this point was not very powerful and hadn't really made an impact on the country just yet. With Marbury versus Madison, they realized they have the power to review constitutional laws, but also actions within the government and deem them to be constitutional or not. this made them an equal branch of the other two. So that was a very important case. Judicial review, you must know that from Marbury versus Madison. It just means they review laws and actions of the government. Quick two other cases by John Marshall that are very important. McCullough versus Maryland said that the Bank of the United States was constitutional, and Gibbons versus Ogden said the states cannot regulate interstate commerce. Remember, the Articles of Confederation did that. It did not work out. The federal government must have the power to regulate interstate commerce for it to be successful. Okay, so let's wrap this all up with sectionalism. What divides our country? One of the major things is the Cotton Gin, which revolutionizes slavery in the country. The Cotton Gin, 1793, by Eli Whitney, really makes slavery explode here in the country, as we've mentioned. Owning slaves in the South really allowed you to be part of the aristocratic class, although 75% of the Southerners in the South do not own slaves. They support it, which is interesting because many of those Southerners support it because they aspire one day to own slaves. Northerners become increasingly critical over the issue of slavery. Southerners obviously become very defensive. You're going to see guys like George Fitzhugh defend slavery as a positive good, saying it's better than being a wage slave to those factories in the North, and that even religion was in the Bible, so it must be, must be all right. African American communities, we're going to see many slaves, have various ways of resisting. So, what is life like under slavery? You're going to see a lot of extended families because families themselves are broken up all the time. You're going to see later on the Second Great Awakening give rise to the abolitionist movement. We'll talk more about those abolitionists in a moment. Ways to resist slavery. You can certainly sabotage equipment, you can run away, you can slow down your work. You're going to see radical rebellions like Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner who are going to lead rebellions, but unfortunately the common theme there is they are unsuccessful, and what happens as a result is stricter slave codes, which is not good for slaves. Abolitionist movement in the North, where you are going to see a free black population in the northern states. You're going to see people like David Walker write a book that tries to gain momentum for the abolitionist movement, saying that African Americans must fight. The American Colonialization Society is set up by guys like Henry Clay in 1823 to send freed slaves to Africa. You can synthesize this with Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and Malcolm X in the 1960s with black separatism. William Lloyd Garrison is a great example of an abolitionist because he writes a newspaper called The Liberator, and this white abolitionist is going to write a lot of ideas for people to read on why slavery is so bad, and not everybody in the North, but many Northerners support such sentiments. The sectional identity of the North, we know the North is not agriculturally based. They are more going to be based off manufacturing. Samuel Slater, the father of the factory system, comes here from England, memorizes the factory layout, and recreates it in the North in Massachusetts. We're going to see the growth of cities. We're going to see Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts be revolutionary for machines. Robert Fulton's Clermont steam engine powered boat be important for transportation. Francis Cabot Lowell comes up with a great idea in Massachusetts to hire young women in the factories for lesser pay. Labor unions are going to start to become a thing. Commonwealth versus Hunt was a court case that said labor unions were allowed to be organized, so that's they're constitutional. That's a good thing. We already talked about the old wave of immigration and how that plays a part in our nation's increase in population. We're going to see a lot of immigrants go to those northern cities for jobs in the factories. Unfortunately, that will lead to nativism by your native-born Americans, who later on create a political party called the Know Nothing Party, which is nativist. Obviously, we can synthesize nativism with many different examples throughout U.S. history, like the Chinese Exclusion Act or even modern day with people being nativists, like trying to build a wall between the United States and Mexico. The economic activities of both the North and the South are linked, so even though they're very different, they need each other. The North needs the Southern raw materials to produce the finished product in the Northern factories. Don't forget that. And obviously, we'll expand more on this in period 5. Finally, to close this all out, the Second Great Awakening, we accredit Charles Finney being the guy who spurts this Second Great Awakening to get people more religious. And one of the reasons that the Second Great Awakening spurs many different movements is that women are involved in this Second Great Awakening. They're having a greater role in the church, and so you're going to see women take a greater role in reforming other areas of society. For example, like temperance. We're going to see Lyman Beecher be the guy who leads the temperance movement, and many women want temperance because of domestic violence. Prison reform. Dorothea Dix, she favors trying to reform prison and trying to make it more more beneficial for those people that are going to be in prison and then later on come back into society. Abolitionism, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, David Walker, people that want to abolish slavery. Many women like Harriet Tubman are involved in this, right? The people trying to get rid of slavery. Women's rights, we talked about Seneca Falls, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, Declaration of Sentiments. Education reform, Horace Mann in Massachusetts, making compulsory attendance, getting the kids out of the factories, getting them to go to school. And then finally, the utopian societies like the Mormons, the Shakers, for example. All of these are spurred by the Second Great Awakening. All right, that is it. I hope this video helps. I hope I know we covered a lot of material here in period 4, and hopefully it sticks with you. If you found this video to help, make sure to give me a like or a subscribe, and have a wonderful day.